Hi guys, we're going to read the next chapter of the Book of Three. We're on chapter 16, Dolly. Taryn turned accusingly to King Edlig. You said nothing of Henwin. You didn't ask me, said Edlig. That's sharp practice, Fluter muttered, even for a king. It's worse than a lie, Taryn said angrily. You'd have let us go on our way and we would have never known what happened to her. You should be ashamed of yourself, Ellenway put in, shaking her finger at the king, who appeared to be most embarrassed at being found out. It's like looking the other way when someone's about to walk into a hole. Finders keepers, the dwarf king snapped. A troop of the fair folk came on her near the Avron banks. She was running through the ravine, and I'll tell you something you don't know. Half a dozen warriors were after her, the henchmen of the horned king, and the troop took care of those warriors. We have our own ways of dealing with you clumsy lummoxes, and they brought your pig here, underground most of the way. No wonder Gwydion could find no tracks, Taryn murmured to himself. The fair folk rescued her, Edlig angrily continued, turning bright red. There's another fine example. Do I get a word of thanks? Naturally not. But I do get called disagreeable names and have nasty thoughts thrown at me. Oh, I can see it in your faces. Edlig is a thief and a wretch. That's what you're saying to yourselves. Well, just for that, you shan't have her back. You'll stay here, all of you, until I feel like letting you go. We're pausing because I can hear my alarm going off right behind the computer. Okay. Ellenway gasped with indignation. If you do that, she cried, you are a thief and a wretch. You gave me your word, and the fair folk don't go back on their words. There was no mention of a pig, no mention at all. Edlig clapped his hands over his paunch and snapped his mouth shut. No, said Taryn, there was not. But there is a question of honesty and honor. Edlig blinked and looked sideways. He took out his orange kerchief and mopped his brow again. Honor, he muttered. Yes, I was afraid it would come to that. True, the fair folk never break their word. Well, he sighed. That's the price of being open-hearted and generous. So be it, you shall have your pig. We shall need to replace the weapons that we lost, Taryn said. What? Screamed Edlig. Are you trying to ruin me? And munchings and crunchings, piped up Gurgi. Taryn nodded. And provisions as well. This is going too far, Edlig shouted. You're bleeding me to death. Weapons, food, pigs. And we beg for a guide to take us to the way. That's not what it says. And we beg for a guide who will take us all the way to Caerdaffel. At this, Edlig nearly exploded, and when he finally calmed himself down, he nodded reluctantly. I shall lend you Dolly, he said. He's the only one I can spare. He clapped his hands and gave orders among the armed dwarves, and then turned back to the companions. Off with you now before I change my mind. Ellenway stepped quickly forward to the throne, and bent and kissed Edlig on the top of his head. Thank you, she whispered. You're a perfectly lovely king. Out! Out! The dwarf cried. As the stone door closed behind him, Taryn saw King Edlig fondling his head and beaming happily. The troop of fair folk led the company down the vaulted corridors. Taryn had at first imagined Edlig's realm to be no more than a maze of underground galleries. To his astonishment, the corridors soon broadened into wide avenues. In great domes far overhead, gems glittered as bright as sunshine. There was no grass, but deep carpets of green lichens stretched out like meadows. There were blue lakes, glistening as much as the jewels above, and cottages and farmhouses. It was difficult for Taryn and his companions to remember that they were underground. I've been thinking, whispered Fluter, that it might be wiser to leave Henwin here until we can return for her. I thought of that too, answered Taryn. It's not that I don't trust Edlig to keep his word, most of the time, but I'm not sure we should take another chance with the lake, and he certainly won't make it easy for us to come back. I'm afraid. No, we must take Henwin while we have the chance. Once she's with me again, I won't let her out of my sight. Suddenly, the fair folk halted at one of the cottages, and from the neatly carpentered pen, Taryn heard a loud "Ploink!" He raced to the sty and Henwin was standing with her front feet on the rails, grunting at the top of her voice. One of the fair folk opened the gate, and the white pig burst out, wriggling and squealing. Tyrion threw his arms around Henwin's neck. "Oh, Hen!" he cried. "Even Menwin thought you were dead." "Clink! Quack!" Henwin chuckled joyfully. Her beady eyes sparkled, and with her great pink snout she rooted affectionately under Tyrion's chin and came so close to knocking him down. "She looks like a wonderful pig," Elenway said, scratching Henwin behind the ears. "It's always nice to see two friends meet again. It's like waking up with the sun shining." "She's certainly a great deal of pig," agreed the bard, "though very handsome, I must say. And clever and noble and brave, wise Gurgi found her." "Have no fear," Tyrinn said with a smile to Gurgi. "There's no chance we'll forget it." Rolling and waddling on her short legs, Henwin followed Tyrinn happily, while the fair folk proceeded across the fields to where a stocky figure waited. The captain of the troop announced that this was Dolly, the guide Edlig had promised. Dolly, short and stumpy, almost as broad as he was tall, wore a rust-colored leather jacket and stout knee-high boots. A round cap covered his head, but not enough to conceal the fringe of flaming red hair. An axe and a short sword hung from his belt, and over his shoulder he wore a stubby bow of the fair folk warriors. Tyrinn bowed politely, and the dwarf stared at him with a pair of bright red eyes and snorted. Then, to Tyrinn's surprise, Dolly took a deep breath and held it until his face turned scarlet and he looked about ready to burst. After a few minutes, the dwarf puffed out his cheeks and snorted again. "What's the trouble?" Tyrinn asked. "You can still see me, can't you?" Dolly burst out angrily. "Of course I can still see you," Tyrinn frowned. "Why shouldn't I?" Dolly gave him a scornful look, but didn't answer. Two of the fair folk led up Mellingar. King Edlig, Tyrinn saw with relief, was good to his word. The saddlebags bulged with provisions, and the white mare also carried a number of spears, arrows, and bows. Short and heavy as were all of the weapons of the fair folk, but sturdy and carefully crafted. Without another word, Dolly beckoned them to follow him across the meadow. Grumbling and muttering to himself, the dwarf led them to what seemed to be the sheer face of a cliff. Only after he had reached it did Tyrinn see that it was a long flight of steps carved into the living rock. Dolly jerked his head towards the stairway, and they began to climb. This passageway of the fair folk was steeper than any of the mountains that they had crossed. Mellingar strained forward, wheezing and gasping. Henwin pulled herself up each step. The stairway turned and twisted. At one point the darkness was such that the companions lost sight of each other. Another time the steps broke off, and the group had to trod down a narrow pathway of hard-packed stones. Sheets of white light rippled ahead, and the travelers found themselves behind a high waterfall. One after the other, they leaped to the glistening rocks and splashed through the foaming stream. And at last they emerged into the cool air of the hills. Dolly squinted up at the sun. "Not much daylight left," he muttered, more gruffly than King Edlig himself. "Don't think that I'm going to walk my legs off all night either. I didn't ask for this work, you know. Got picked for it. Guiding a crew of what? An assistant pig keeper? A yellow-headed idiot with a harp? A girl with a sword? A shaggy what is it? Not to mention the livestock. All you can hope for is you don't run into a real war band. They'd do you for, they would. There's not one of you that looks as though he can handle a blade. Humph." This was the most Dolly had spoken since they had left Edlig's realm, and despite the dwarf's uncomplimentary opinions, Tyrinn hoped he would finally come around to being civil. Dolly, however, had said all he intended to say for a while. Later, when Tyrinn ventured to speak to him again, the dwarf turned angrily away and started holding his breath again. "For goodness sakes," Elenway cried, "I wish you'd stop that. It makes me feel as if I drunk too much water just watching you." "It still doesn't work," Dolly growled. "Whatever are you trying to do?" Tyrinn asked. Even Henwin stared curiously at the dwarf. "What does it look like?" Dolly answered. "I'm trying to make myself invisible." "That's an odd thing to attempt." remarked Fluter. I'm supposed to be invisible, snapped Dolly. My whole family can do it, just like that, like blowing out a candle, but not me. No wonder they all laugh at me. No wonder Edlig sends me out with a pack of fools. If there's anything nasty or disagreeable to be done, it's always fine, good old Dolly. If there's gems to be cut, or blades to be decorated, or arrows to be footed, that's a job for good old Dolly. The dwarf held his breath again, this time so long that his face turned blue and his ears trembled. I think you're getting it now, said the bard, with an encouraging smile. I can't see you at all. No sooner had the remark passed his lips, the harp string snapped in two. Fluter looked sorrowfully at the instrument. Blast the thing, he muttered. I knew I was exaggerating somewhat. I only did it to make him feel better. He actually seemed to be fading a bit around the edges. If I could carve gems and do all those other things, Taryn remarked sympathetically to Dolly, I wouldn't mind not being invisible. All I know is vegetables and horseshoes. And not too much about either. It's silly, Ellenway added, to worry because you can't do something you simply can't do. That's worse than trying to make yourself taller by standing on your head. None of these well-intentioned remarks cheered the dwarf, who strode angrily ahead, swinging his axe from side to side. Despite his bad temper, Dolly was an excellent guide, Taryn had realized. Most of the time the dwarf said little beyond his usual grunts and snorts, making no attempt to explain the path he followed, or to suggest how long it would be for the companions to reach Cair Dothel. Taryn, nevertheless, had learned a great deal of woodcraft and tracking during his journey. He was aware the companions had begun turning westward to descend in the hills. They had, during the afternoon, covered more ground than Taryn had thought possible, and he knew it was thanks to Dolly's expert guidance. When he congratulated the dwarf, Dolly only humphed and held his breath. They camped that night on the sheltered slope of the last barrier of the mountains. Gurgi, whom Taryn had taught to build a fire, was delighted to be useful, and he cheerfully gathered twigs and dug a cooking pit. And, to the surprise of all, distributed the provisions equally, without saving out a private share for his own crunchings and munchings later on. Dolly refused to do anything whatsoever. He took his own food from the rather large leather wallet hanging at his side, and sat on a rock, chewing glumly. He snorted with annoyance between every mouthful, and occasionally held his breath. Keep at it, old boy, called Fluter. Another try might do it. Your outline definitely looks blurred. Oh, hush, Ellenway told the bard. Don't encourage him, or he'll decide to hold his breath forever. Just lending support, explained the crestfallen bard. A flam never gives up. I don't see why a dwarf should. Henwin had not left Taryn's side all day. Now, as he spread his cloak out on the ground, the white pig grunted with pleasure and waddled over and hunkered down beside him. Her crinkled ears relaxed, and she thrust her snout out comfortably against Taryn's shoulder, and chuckled contentedly, a blissful smile on her face. Soon the whole weight of her head was pressed against him, making it impossible for Taryn to roll onto his side. Henwin snored luxuriously, and Taryn resigned himself to sleeping, despite the assortment of whistles and groans directly below his ear. I'm glad to see you, Hen, he said, and I'm glad you're glad to see me too. But I wish you wouldn't be so loud about it. Next morning they turned their backs on the Eagle Mountains and began heading for what Taryn hoped would be Cair Dothel. The trees rose more densely around them. Taryn turned for the last glimpse of the eagle itself, tall and serene in the distance. He was grateful their path had not led them over it, but in his heart he hoped that one day he would return and climb its towers of sun-flecked ice and black stone. Until his journey he had never seen mountains, but now he understood why Gwydion had spoken longingly of Cair Dothel. His thought led Taryn to wonder what else Gwydion had expected to learn from Henwin. When they halted, he spoke to Fluter about it. There may be someone in Cair Dothel who can understand her, but if we can only get her to prophecy now, she might tell us something important. I could try a new spell, offered Ellenway. Ashford taught me some others, but I don't know if they'd be of any use. They haven't anything to do with oracular pigs. I do know a wonderful one for summoning toads. Ashwin was about to teach me the spell for opening locks, but I don't suppose I'll ever learn that now. Even so, locks haven't much to do with pigs either. Ellenway knelt beside Henwin and whispered rapidly. Henwin seemed to listen politely for a while, grinning broadly, wheezing and snuffling. She gave no sign of understanding what the girl was saying, and at last, with a joyful "Whink!" she broke away and ran towards Taryn, wriggling gleefully. "It's no use," Taryn said, "and there's no sense in losing time. I hope they have letter sticks at Cairdoffel, though I doubt it. Whatever Dalban has, it seems to be the only one of its kind in all Prydain." They resumed their march. Gurgi, now the official cook and fire-maker, strode boldly behind the dwarf. Dolly led the companions through a clearing just past the line of alders. A few moments later, the dwarf halted and cocked his head. Taryn heard it too, a faint, high-pitched screaming. It seemed to be coming from a twisted thorn bush. Drawing his sword, Taryn hurried past the dwarf, and at first he could see nothing but a dark tangle. But when he drew closer, he stopped abruptly. It was a Gwythant. And that is the end of chapter 16. Next time, we'll read chapter 17, The Fledgling. I hope you guys are having a good time. I hope you're staying happy and safe. Until we read our next story, goodbye!